Hello everyone, and welcome to this video series on animation and transition. Our agenda, we're going to focus on what is the CSS transition property, what is the CSS animation property, and kind of walk through how to implement those two properties. So the big question is why use animation? There are many reasons why people use animation in their sites, but one use case for adding animation is that subtle animation can help the end user navigate your site and guide the end user's attention to certain areas. So for example, if let's just go and choose Dunwoody's website, right? So if you look here in this navigation, it's very subtle, but if I hover over this about link, there's some animation that occurs. Yes, we see the bigger effect of the animation that once you hover over this about, you see that this bigger navigation or sub navigation kind of scrolls down. But even within the navigation link, right, if I hover over that, there's this slight fade to white background and the text transitions to this red color. So subtle navigation or subtle animation really helps the end user for navigation. It can also just kind of draw attention to certain areas. And so even when I hover over this about, right, this area of the site popped down, and we can now go and click on other links. But even within this link, like I said, there's some subtle animation that's going on where it's slightly fading in and out to this white and red background. So another thing about CSS animation is that you can create some visual appeal. That would be another use case. Animation done well can engage the end user and even produce some interactivity. And so you may have heard of a site called www.awards. So I think it's www.ards.com. And a lot of these sites here have a lot of animation built into them. So if we just take a look down here, let's take a look at this one here. This one looks like it's full of animation. All right. So I'm willing to bet once I scroll down, you're going to start to see some animation occur. Even these little bitty things, these little bitty airplanes, these little bitty ideas, this little bitty, I guess, I don't know what you want to call that, but like a little bitty spider. That's animation that you can build into your site. These two arms going back and forth, right? And this site is done well, I think. You'll see that these flowers in these particular circles, when I hover, right, there's some what we call transformation happening here, where it's growing. But then even you have this circle that's kind of going in a circular motion. So this site has a lot of animation built into it. Like I said, animation really helps with visual appeal, and also there's a level of engagement that occurs as well. Again, there are some sites that overly use animation and actually takes away from the experience of the website. All right. So the first CSS property we're going to talk about is this CSS property called transition. That's the name of the CSS property. And you'll see that the two big things here is that it has an initial state and it has an end state. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be animating the in-between state. So from what happens in between the end state, the initial state and the end state. And so here's an example of the transition property. Where it's going to say transition all animatable property, all animatable CSS properties, and that transition should occur for 3 seconds. So here's the entire declaration. So watch what happens to this red box here. All right. So a very small subtle transition that occurs where the width is going to grow, the width is going to expand, and also we're going to transition the background color. So it goes from this red to this purple. All right. And so that's an example of CSS animation. So if we were to right click and inspect, you'll see here's the box, right? And then here's the transition property. We also have a border radius on there. So this is what we call the initial state, right? So we have a width, we have a height, we have a background color of red, and then a transition. The first value is going to be the width. We're going to do that for 2 seconds. The height, we're going to do that for 4 seconds. The background color, we're going to do that for 4 seconds here, and the border radius is 5 seconds. So that's where the transition is defined. It's always going to be defined within the initial state, and that's just the default CSS style rule. But what's going to trigger this CSS is going to be the hover effect. And so if we were to click over here and look at the hover style rule for this here, you'll see that it's going to transition to, it's going to create a width of 600 pixels. The border radius is going to increase to 80 pixels. The background color is going to become purple. Let me just show you an example of this here. So here I have an example. I have a div element, and I gave it an ID that's equal to transition underscore EX, and I have an image nested within, and I can make this look a little bit better here, right? And I have some CSS style rules to my right here. The first one here is my default. This is what we consider my initial state. So I'll just put a comment here. So that's my initial state. It's going to start off at 300 pixels. And I have a transition property that's width, and that's 5 seconds. There's many other values that this can take. So if I were to go here and just go W3 transition property, and let's just take a look at the definition for that property here. So we click here. Whoops. Let's go ahead and click on this one here. And these are the different values. So here's the shorthand property transition, but then here's the more specific CSS properties that you can specifically tug at when you're implementing transition. So let's look at an example here. Let me see if I can get a more inclusive example. Let's go to exercise 5 here. Actually, let's go up to here. This is probably a better one here, because this has at least 4 of them here. So the first one here is going to be the value that I want to transition, or the property that I want to transition. In this case here, I want the width to go from 100 pixels to 300 pixels. The second value you can specify is how long do you want your transition to occur. And so you can say 2 seconds. You can actually say 5 seconds. And then here is something called how this transition is going to occur. And so that's going to be the timing function. And we could say linear, and there's a number of different values we can specify. We can say linear, ease in, ease out, ease in, out. And that's typically the third value you will put for the transition property. And then the last value here is the delay, the transition delay. So you could say delay this for up to 1 second. So that transition won't occur up until 1 second. So here, if I hover, count to 1, then the transition occurs, right? So if I were to change this to about 4 and hit run, right, it's going to seem like it's not going to transition, but like I said, the transition delay is 4 seconds. So if I hover over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then now my transition is going to occur. And so that's kind of how you would specify the value, and this is the shorthand property. But again, there are some more specific properties that you can use other than the shorthand property. So you can, if you wanted to, you can just go ahead and use the more specific property of the ones I have highlighted here. So that's an example of how you would use the transition property. And in this case here, I have the default CSS, the initial state, and then the end state is going to be where I'll use a hover. And typically you'll use a hover to transition to the end state. And what's going to happen is that I want to transition the width. I could just also put all here, right? All is basically saying all animatable properties. And so this will go from 300 pixels to 500 pixels. And then also what I have here is a hover on the image, so that when I do hover over this box element and this image, it's going to basically float to the right. So watch what happens here when I trigger this animation. So it gives the illusion that this little guy is walking, or this person is walking. I don't know if there's a little person or not, but this stick figure is walking across the screen. Again, you can go to this URL if you want to play around with that and take a look at it a little bit more in depth. But this is essentially the CSS that you would use here. And again, what the magic here is this transition property. It's saying all in 5 seconds. All right, so again, here are just a sample of all the animatable properties, right? You can animate width, border, width, right, color, top, opacity, anything that typically takes a numeric measurement. And it's not only just numeric measurement, there's other factors like color and so forth, but any particular property that takes a numeric value can be animated. And there's some other things that can be animated as well. And these are just some steps that you can walk through, right? So the first step is select an element you would like to implement a transition on. And you define what's going to trigger the transition. It could be a hover. And typically that's what people do is like a hover pseudo class. You can also use JavaScript or a scroll. So when somebody scrolls their mouse button down, but that usually takes some JavaScript. But I would say the most common is the hover pseudo class that would trigger the animation to occur. And then here, step 3, you're going to select the various properties you like to transition. You could just say all, and that will transition all. You can select the transition duration. You can do a timing function. And you can also add a delay to that as well. Here's an activity that I would like for you to take a stab at. This is an activity here that we're going to work through in class. This will be extra credit, and I'll open it up during class here. So for those who do want to earn some points, you can do that as we go through it over in class here. But essentially what I want you to do is to try to recreate this animation that you see here. So once you hover over it, this box element is going to turn to a green ball. And then once you're done hovering over it, it'll go back to this red box. So real quick, let me show you another animation here. There's some cool things you can do with images. In the past, I've had a number of folks kind of get creative with their images here. So here I just have a div element, right? Here's the default or initial state of my box element. I have display block, margin auto to center it. I gave it some height and width dimensions, and I added a background image here. And then I have a transition property. Here's my magic, right? And that goes in remember, this goes in the initial state. And then I'm going to transition here I'm going to add a new background image, right? So here's my initial background image, right? And I'm going to add a new background image, and I'm going to add another CSS property to transition to, right? And this one's going to transition and scale the image out. So watch what happens here. There's the snow, right? So and now once I hover off of it, right, it goes back to the initial state. And so this lasts about this entire transition lasts about 5 seconds between the initial and the end state. So you can get really creative with some of these different things here and how you use the transition property. And like, again, people typically have a pseudo class where you just use a hover and define the end state. So it's really 2 things here, the initial state, right, then the end state, and then your transition property goes inside of the initial state. You guys stay tuned. We're going to talk about the animation property. The animation property can pretty much do everything the transition property can do and more. And so stay tuned for the next video.